Thank you, Alice. I'd like to welcome you all to the 2016 Delprat Distinguished Lecture. My name is Alvin Lynch, and tonight I'm representing both the Metallurgical Society and the local South Queensland AusIMM branch. The Delprat, GKD Delprat Distinguished Lecture Series was initiated by Professor Alvin Lynch, who, with his co-authors of the History of Flotation, assigned the royalties from the book sales to the AusIMM Metallurgical Society. Alvin has also assigned the royalties from the recent publication Communition. These funds are used to support the Delprat Distinguished Lecture Series, originally themed on flotation, and now diverging onto other metallurgical themes. I would like to gratefully acknowledge our sponsors, CITIC, SMCC, Extreme Metallurgy, Magatone, OMC, Pioneer, as well as the AusIMM. This is the sixth in the series and is hosted by the Metallurgical Society of the Southern Queensland branch of the AusIMM with support from the JKMC. I'd also like to recognise the sponsorship provided by the local branch and the JKMRC. Thank you, Alice, for the refreshments that will be available after this lecture. For the chartered professionals present, please note that attendance at this lecture provides 1 hour of professional development. I nailed that, didn't I? By way of background, Daniel Delprat was an engineer and metallurgist and a pioneer of the Australian mining industry. He came to Broken Hill in 1898 to become general manager of BHP. BHP had become very prosperous through the mining of the rich silver-leaded secondary or oxidised ores, but could not extract the valuable zinc from the primary ore, the so-called sulphide product. Working with Potter, Delprat had observed in the laboratory that they could make the zinc sulphide in the tailings attached to gas bubbles and float, thereby affecting the separation. A large-scale processing plant was quickly built to put this research to practice, and the process worked. Delprat had changed processing practice by building one of the first industrial flotation plants, and zinc production became a major industry. The 2016 Delprat Distinguished Lecturer is Emeritus Professor Tim Napier-Munn. Tim is a minerals engineer for over 45 years of experience, a well-rounded experience in the mineral industry research and development, with degrees from the Imperial College, London, and its University in South Africa. As most of the audience will appreciate, Tim joined the JKMRC in 1985, becoming director in 1997, and the inaugural managing director of the JK Tech in 2001. Many of us know Tim through his professional development courses, particularly the immensely useful Statistics for Minerals Engineers, which he has been delivering for over 20 years. Along the way, Tim has managed to write and publish over 140 papers and articles, as well as being the editor of the JKMRC Blue Book on Comminution, as well as the 7th edition of Barry Moore's Mineral Processing Technology. Tim is a member of the editorial board of the Minerals Engineering Journal, a founding board member of the CEEC International, and a fellow of the AusIMM. In recognition of his considerable contributions to the minerals industry, Tim has received the Fruited Medal in 2009 from the UK Institute of Materials, Minerals and Mining, the AusIMM President's Award in 2011, and the AusIMM Sir Willis Connolly Medal in 2005. Tim is presently Emeritus Professor of the JKMRC, working with graduate students, as well as consultant to the JK Tech. Tim is also a passionate astronomer and has a love of all things bio. Tim's contribution to the international mineral processing community is distinguished. The results from his work, research and leadership have led to significant tangible improvements in the practice of mineral processing and delivering benefits for the minerals industry worldwide. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Tim Napier-Munn.
They say a drowning man sees his whole life pass before him. I just felt like a drowning man the last couple of minutes. Thank you so much for that effusive introduction. What Andrew didn't tell you, he's an astronomer as well, so we are rather curious people. And Andrew played a very important part in my life. He mentioned the stats courses, which, as you know, I give, and he actually was the man who asked me to give the very first course to an industry company. He was working for BOC Gases in Sydney at the time. And he said, could you come and talk to us about how to run plant trials? And that was 20 years ago, and the rest, as I say, is history. So the check's in the post, Andrew. Thank you for that. Well, thank you all for coming and adding another hour or so to your working day, which I really appreciate. I hope you won't think that your time has been entirely wasted. I must thank the AusIMM for asking me to give this series of lectures. I'm very honoured by the request, and I hope I can do it justice. I must also thank Andrew as the local guy organising the event here, and his colleagues, and also the people at the JK, Tammy and Sherin and others for actually doing all the hard work on the ground to make this happen. This is not going to be a technical talk, you'll be relieved to hear. I'm going to say a few technical things and touch on some technical issues, but what I really want to talk about, as the name suggests, is the innovation process in mineral processing in a general sense, and talk a bit about the history, the past, the present, and where we're headed. And I want to make 3 points, I think, really. Number one is innovation is not optional. It's critical to our business. Number two, we've done a really good job in the past, and Andrew pointed out all the way back to Delprat's days, and I'm going to touch on the history of innovation in mineral processing. And I want to make that point, and also to try and tease out some of the issues that nurture innovation and make it possible. And then my third point is a little bit more concerning. I want to look into the future a little bit and argue that I think the conditions are developing where it will be harder to innovate in the future, and that should be a disturbing point for all of us. I'm going to talk as a metallurgist to metallurgists. So if you have the misfortune not to be a member of this wonderful profession, don't worry, I'm going to talk in quite general terms, so Alice, even geologists. I want to recognise my predecessors in this role. Mike Nelson, who was the inaugural lecturer from University of Utah. Of course, Alvin, everybody knows, the founding director of this organisation here. Graham Jameson of Jameson Cell fame. John Ralston, founding director of the Walk Centre. And last year, Bill Johnson, who's forgotten more about the practice of mineral processing than the rest of us will ever know. So it's a very distinguished group, and I'm conscious that I've got very big shoes to fill. By the way, I was looking at this list and I suddenly realised the criterion by which the AusIMM selects its Delprat lecturer. Your name has to end in an N. Preferably your surname. In Alvin's case, we'll allow his first name. So this was my hypothesis, and in the best scientific traditions, I collected some additional data to test that hypothesis. And it supported me. And I even did a little calculation. You'll be interested to know the chance of 6 individuals selected at random with first or second names that end in N is a 1 chance in 200,000 of that happening. Clearly, that's not a chance of it. So I have discovered the AusIMM secret. And the bad news for you, if you have aspirations to be a Delprat lecturer and your name doesn't end in N, you have no chance. Before I go any further, I just want to thank 6 distinguished individuals who, most of whom I know very well, I've known for years. They're in this space big time in innovation in mineral processing, and they gave me a very generous amount of their time while I was preparing this talk, and so I'd like to thank them very much for that. Now, I'm going to show you some slides. That's what you do these days. And whenever I do that, I hear this little voice over my shoulder, the voice of one of the great innovators of our time, and probably any time, the co-founder of Apple Computer, Steve Jobs, who said, if you need slides, it shows you don't know what you're talking about. Well, I guess my defense is that we can't all be Steve Jobs, and most of us need all the help we can get. And as to whether I know what I'm talking about, you'll have to make that judgment at the end of the show. So let's talk about innovation. What is it? And the best way to think about this, I think, is to contrast it with invention. Invention is the creation of new knowledge. Innovation is the application of new knowledge for benefit. Or somebody much more concisely put it, invention turns money into knowledge, and innovation turns knowledge into money. And that's a really key point, because innovation is about making money, taking an invention or a new idea and actually getting a return from it. And the important thing that everybody knows or needs to know is that innovation is much harder, much more expensive, and takes much longer than invention. So it's a difficult business. The second point I want to make is that innovation can happen anywhere. I think most people think that innovation is a new app on their smartphone. Well, that's true, but it can happen absolutely anywhere. And in our industry, it can be in industrial relations, health and safety, finance, procurement, management, environmental, social, exploration, mining, mineral processing, extraction, and the lot. I'm going to concentrate on mineral processing because that's all I know about, but remember, these lessons, I think, are of general application. And the final point is innovation is not optional. The whole story of mankind, from wandering the African plains to essentially having completely dominated the third planet from the sun, it is the third planet, isn't it? Is a story entirely of innovation. So it's in the DNA, it's going to happen. My argument, I guess, is I'd rather it happened on our terms than somebody else's. So what this talk is can we get control over this process? Well, Andrew's talked about Delprat. One of the things I found out about him in his Wikipedia article is that it's said that he worked with Van der Waals of Van der Waals force fame at the University of Amsterdam. So he had a really very good technical and scientific background, and of course he came to BHP with some mining experience in Spain and some engineering experience in the UK, and you know, he was the big player, one of the big players, exactly as Andrew said. And the book, which he mentioned by Alvin and Greg Harbutt and Mike Nelson, is a brilliant read. If you haven't read the story, it's a great story. It's a human story as well as a technical story. So when I looked at this story, I asked myself, why did he succeed? What was special about the conditions? What do we learn about innovation from Delprat's story? Well, number one, there was a crisis. Crisis is a wonderful thing for driving innovation. The prospect of imminent execution concentrates the mind wonderfully, I think somebody once said. And the crisis was they were going to go out of business because they couldn't treat the sulfides, as Andrew said. Second one, there's a lot of competition. There were a lot of mines at Broken Hill. They competed with each other in a very interesting way. But there was also collaboration. It was a hotbed of invention and innovation, and there was a lot of collaboration between the people there. Of course, he was a skilled technologist. He knew what he was doing. He had an entrepreneurial nature. He was prepared to take risks. And the final one, I think, is not often thought about. He had power. He was a GM. He was appointed by the board of Broken Hill Proprietary. So he could sign checks. And I think that combination of conditions made a very powerful environment for innovation. Well, everyone says we have to innovate, and you know, why do we need to be told to innovate? Well, if you need to be persuaded, then this is a graph that people often use these days. You've probably seen it before. It's the Mining Multifactor Productivity Index put out by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which hasn't covered itself in glory recently, but and what it measures, as it says, is multi-factor productivity. So there's a lot that goes into this index. It's quite a complicated index. And in fact, I haven't shown you the earlier part, but it grew from back here with improvements in industrial relations and technology until it got to this point, and then fell off a cliff in the early 2000s. There are several reasons for this decline. And by the way, this trend, of course, is unsustainable. We're going to go out of business as an industry if this continues. There is some little evidence of a turnover, as you can see at the bottom here. There are several reasons, but one of them is the drop in grades that are being experienced in many, not all, but many operations, which of course means you've got to move more tons to get an ounce of gold or a pound of copper. And it is unsustainable, and the solution to that is you really have to do things differently, and that's what innovation, of course, is all about. And we're used to seeing these wonderful headlines in the newspapers. This one was relating to the so-called collapse in commodity prices, which we've been there before, of course. The commodity prices now are actually not so bad in real terms compared to a few decades ago. But they are well off the highs, and of course everyone rushes around and tries to react sensibly to that situation. And the general agreement is innovation is a good thing, and of course that makes its way into the newspapers. So all the great and the good tell us that the solution to all of our problems is innovation. And when I say the great and the good, I mean the great and the good. Our noble leader, Mr. Turnbull, is very fond of this word, and he is trying to persuade us that his whole government is innovative, and he wants to make the whole country a more innovative and sophisticated organisation. Well, sometimes actually you don't need innovation. Sometimes a system reaches the perfect point in its development. No further innovation required. And this is such a system. This system, apparently, we're told, is completely unchanged from, this is the saltwater crocodile, from 55 million years ago, and relatively unchanged from 200 million years ago. Why is that? Evolution stopped because it's perfectly developed for its ecological niche. It doesn't need any more innovation. This is the exception rather than the rule, of course, but we can find a crocodile in mineral processing, and it's this. This is a wonderful picture of a cone crusher. Some of you have seen this before, I use it often. Taken from a book published in 1932, and of course the crusher itself goes back several years before that. And this is a cone crusher taken off the internet a few weeks ago. And if you study the main features, you'll find that in every single major aspect, it is identical. It's not similar, it is absolutely identical. This one's a bit smaller than the other one. And the one on the right has automatic set regulation and computer control and is made of different materials. But the way to crush a rock of the type that is fed to a cone crusher was worked out a long time ago. And we can't do it any better. If you change the application and you change some other things, then we have different technologies. But the cone crusher really works very well. So that's our mineral processing crocodile. But that's the exception, it's not the rule. I wrote down, while I was thinking about this talk, I decided I would set myself a 5-minute task and write down all of the innovations in mineral processing I could think of since 1950. And this is the list I came up with. So this is absolutely not comprehensive, because I only gave myself 5 minutes. And you will have your own list, and I'm sure there are things that you would like on this list that are not on it, but here it is. Increases in scale, the dense medium cyclone, CIP, CIL, gravity concentration, high pressure grinding rolls, high intensity flotation, ag-sag mills, fine grinding, high rate thickeners, high intensity mag seps, selective reagents, analytical chemistry changes, automatic quantitative mineralogy, process simulation, instrumentation, process control, and there are lots of those. Now, we're told that we're a conservative industry. We're very reluctant to change. I think we're pretty good at this, actually. I think in the past we've been very good at it. And that's, as I say, I'm sure you could double that list without too much. If I took a quick poll now, we'd at least double that list. So the past is a different place, but we did pretty well in the past. So what I want to do now quickly is to pick a few case studies, which I'm going to deal with very quickly because we don't have lots of time, and tell the story, and then try and learn in each case what we can deduce from the story about innovation and what makes it work. And these are the ones I'm going to talk about: increases in scale, the HPGR, the Jameson flotation cell, automated quantitative mineralogy, the MIM Linz Inc story, and process simulators. So I'll deal with each one quickly. Innovation in scale. So this is things getting bigger. And the question is, are we running out of puff? So this is a wonderful picture Elaine Whiteman gave me from the Mufulira plant in Zambia in the early 1970s. This is a 20,000 ton per day plant. There are 28 mills in that plant. And here's a picture of the 40-foot by 28 megawatt SAG mill, or AG mill, I should say, at CITIC Sino Iron WA for a 200,000 ton per day plant. Now, I've just been told I can't go back because I'll overwrite something, so I can't show you the earlier one. Just imagine that picture. So 20,000 tons per day, 28 mills, 200,000 tons per day, 6 mills. Not a fair comparison, different odds, all that stuff, but that's a multiplier getting on for 50, 50. In flotation, 1.3 cubic meters. I mean, this wouldn't be regarded as a decent sized pilot plant today. Notice the guy, by the way, not a single piece of personal protective equipment. Yeah, occupational health and safety hadn't been invented back in 1959. And here's what you can find today. And yes, the opposition has one as well. I asked a guy at Tech, I said, can you give me a picture of your big cell? He said, oh, it might be a bit difficult. I said, well, I've got the competitions. I got one within 2 hours, I think. But the point is that upgrade is about 450 to 1 in volume terms, not in throughput, but in volume. So there's, we know this. Anyone who's been in this game for any length of time has seen this trend going on and on in all parts of the business. So what do we learn from this? Almost all these developments are done by manufacturers, vendors. The main drivers, of course, are operating capital cost per ton per hour, so trying to get that down, and competition between the vendors, which is hot. We mustn't forget enabling technologies, materials, computer-aided design that make it all possible. So the question is, can we go on indefinitely? The death of scale has been confidently predicted for decades, and it hasn't happened yet. The thing that interests me particularly is, can grinding efficiency go on forever? Can specific energy in SAG mills, for example, go on even to the very big mills? And the experts tell me they see no end to this. So the answer is probably yes. So we'll leave that hanging in the air, that question. The HPGR, lots of you are familiar with this device, invented by a wonderful man whom I had the privilege to meet, Professor Klaus Schönert, who was making studies of the fundamentals of how rocks break. He was squeezing them in laboratory devices and working out the best way to break them. And I guess the answer, by the way, is to squeeze them until they fail in tension. And what he then said to himself, well, how can I make that happen very fast and in an energy efficient way and at a finer size? And he ended up with a rolls crusher in which one rolls was mounted against a hydraulic ram, which allowed you to apply a force to the material passing through. And he patented that and he licensed it to German companies, and the rest, as they say, is history. Of course, it went into cement, where it was enormously successful. But what's the lesson of Schönert's development? Number one, it came from academia, which is an interesting fact. But his work, if you read about it, if you talk to him about it, was always done in an industrial context. The work, although it was fundamental, was always expected to eventually apply to the real world. When we took it into mineral processing, we borrowed it from another industry where it had been very successful, cement. Interestingly, the first application in mineral processing was for a very specific perceived benefit, and that was selective liberation of diamond. And I was actually working for De Beers when this happened, so I had the privilege, as I said, of meeting Schönert, visiting him in Clausthal where he was working, and we brought him out to Johannesburg to talk to us. And we did test work which showed that there was evidence for selective liberation of diamond, which of course is the big prize. Liberate the diamond without breaking them is a really good idea. So we did pilot plant work, we put in full-scale equipment, and of course a lot of diamond mines now have high-pressure grinding rolls. And then the hard rock people came along, what Peter Munro calls proper ores, which I find thoroughly insulting. Diamonds are proper ores too. But non-diamond people came along and said, this is interesting, it looks like there is a possible energy benefit here. And slowly but surely, a place was found for this technology in the pantheon of grinding technologies. 25 years. I mean, how long is a piece of string? But you can make an argument that when you started thinking about it to the point where you could buy one off the shelf from one of the German manufacturers, 25 years. I'll come back to this point. Some of you may remember, who are interested in the story, that there were horrendous problems with the wear of the rolls when they were first used in hard rock operations. They were solved by some great work by the manufacturers, so they were very important. And the protection afforded by a patent, the preparedness to defend the patent, which Schönert had to do in a major action in the United States, in which the American judge miraculously ruled against the Americans and in his favor, And the ability to license, in other words, have a commercialization path was critical. Now the Jameson cell, Graham Jameson's development, has a very similar story. It's a very interesting story. And I talked to Graham about this in some depth. Again, it started in academia. Graham was doing postdoc work at Imperial College in London, in Chem-Eng department, and in the mineral processing department, where I did my undergraduate degree, there was a wonderful guy called Joe Kitchener, and he was one of the great flotation chemists, one of the very few academics who refused to become a professor because he didn't want to do administration work. And he was a great man. And Graham and he talked, and Kitchener said to Graham, look, chemistry is all fine, but don't forget the physics of flotation. It's just as important. And physics meant bubbles. And Graham was really interested in bubbles. He'd done a PhD in bubbles. And he went away and he did work that showed that the rate of flotation depends on the bubbles and the bubble size and how many bubbles you've got. And he started thinking about what's a better way to produce bubbles, and that led to the famous downcomer, which is the basis of the Jameson cell. And again, the rest, as I say, is history. So what do we learn from that? Well, again, it was a fundamental study that kicked it off. But Kitchener and Jameson were always intended that this work have relevance, and flotation was always the target. Again, patent protection, defense, and licensing is key. You talk to Graham about this, he'll bend your ear big time on the subject, and he's had to defend his patent as well. And of course, he had a commercialization route. Tundra is the commercialization company at Uni of Newcastle, and of course, as we'll see in a moment, some of the early trials were done at MIM, and that led to MIM technology as it then was taking the license, which of course they still have. So the commercialization route was important, as was the link to industry. There was a real problem that needed to be solved, and so it was possible to evaluate this technology in the real world. 20 years. 20 years? 15? 25? Doesn't matter. Lots. A very long time. A long, sustained attack on the problem.
And so to what I think is one of the great stories of Australian metallurgical ingenuity of recent decades, the Mount Isa lead zinc story, which is really encapsulated in this one now quite famous graph. The people involved were Bill Johnson, Joe Pease, Michael Young, Peter Munro and others. The graph shows time along the x-axis and various performance criteria up the y-axis. The key lines to look at are the dark descending line in the middle part of the plot, and associated with it you can see a line of circular symbols. The continuous line is zinc recovery in the lead zinc concentrator at Mount Isa, and the line of circles is the liberation of the zinc mineral sphalerite. That descending trend of recovery, I was told by those involved, was unsustainable and would have led most likely to the operation becoming uneconomic. And so it essentially was an existential crisis. Now, in order to solve it, a team of very experienced, knowledgeable metallurgists came together to analyze the problem and to devise a solution. In simple terms, the problem is clear from the other line. You can see there the descending degree of mineral liberation. And they knew about that because they were actually making measurements of liberation using old-fashioned point counting, which most people wouldn't have done. So they were able to formulate a solution over time, which involved a significant change to the grinding and classification circuits, of course, to achieve better liberation. And as you can see from the graph, that led to a sustained improvement and essentially a solution of the problem. Now, while that was going on as a separate exercise, Mount Isa was developing some new fine grinding technology in order to solve a similar problem at the MacArthur River project, which has a very fine grained ore and is difficult to liberate. That new fine grinding technology became what we now know as the Iser mill. The Iser mill was in fact piloted in the lead zinc concentrator, at Mount Isa while it was being developed, and later became part of the solution to the lead zinc problem, as well as enabling the MacArthur River project, which was owned by Mount Isa, to successfully go ahead. And of course, another technology that was piloted and became part of the lead zinc concentrator at Mount Isa was the Jameson cell that we talked about before. So it's actually a really nice story of invention and innovation that led essentially to the saving of one project and the creation of another. So what do we learn from that story? Well, firstly, crisis drove the study and the innovation, and a crisis is a great driver of change. A skilled and experienced metallurgical team was essential to the solution. This might sound like a rather obvious statement, but it's an important one to make because I want to come back to it a little bit later in this talk. Thirdly, the regular mineralogy measurements were essential to troubleshooting the problem and finding the solution, and that was a key measurement which would now probably be made, of course, by MLA and QuemScan technology. In terms of the Iser mill, there was a commercialization route for the technology. MIM already had its own technology company, now Glencore Technology, and that took on the commercialization of the Iser mill. Again, it's a long story, many years. You can certainly make a case for 10 years. So it needed a long-term commitment, particularly from the board. The board, I'm told, were very supportive, provided capital to do the work, and were prepared to take risks, and this was a really important aspect of the story. And it's been published in many publications, including this one. Well, talking of liberation studies, which were so important to this story, the next story concerns the development of automated quantitative mineralogy based on electron microscopes. This was pioneered by CSIRO in the development of QuemSem, now QuemScan, back in the 70s and 80s. And they turned really an electron microscope into a system for providing quantitative measurement of the composition of mineral particles, so you could understand your ore better, and you could troubleshoot concentrators to see where perhaps liberation was inadequate, and to devise solutions accordingly. In the 1990s, the JK came along and felt that it had an alternative way of doing this, and it recruited a man called Yinggu. You can see him in the photograph at the bottom of the slide there. And he built a piece of software that also turned an electron microscope into a quantitative measurer of mineral composition. And those two systems then developed commercially and competed with each other, and really provided a radically new tool for practicing metallurgists to use to understand their ores better and to troubleshoot their concentrate. The story provided, I think, the following lessons. Again, academia and government research were the basis for the development. The links to industry were there right from the beginning, and in fact the thing would have had no purpose without those links. So the development took place in the context of trying to solve real industrial problems. The timeline again was very long. This number is starting to become quite familiar to us, I think. Again, it's difficult to know when to start and finish, but it's easy to make the case for a 20-year timeline. Commercialization was again essential. CSIRO started a new company called Intellection. JK Tech already had, or JK had its own commercialization company, JK Tech, so they provided the commercialization path. When you develop a new system or device or widget, the launch customers are actually key to its success. In the case of the JK's MLA, the launch customer was Anglo Platinum in South Africa, and they were really very important to the MLA story, first of all in taking the risk of buying an untested system, and secondly, they put a lot of input into helping us design it and make it fit for purpose. And one has to say that the competition between CSIRO and QuemSem and JK and MLA was fierce and bitter, and in fact I have the scars to prove it, and it was pretty tough for those of us competing, but of course, as all competition does, it drove spectacular advances in the technology, speeded up the development process, and was very good for the industry because it got better products as a consequence.
And the final one I want to talk about, because it wouldn't be appropriate not to in this place, simulation software. And you're all, most of you, familiar with this story. But the point I want to make about it is that it started, and Bill Whiten is here, he was the major player with Alvin Lynch. It started really as a model building exercise with students going to site, developing models that were fit for purpose because they were developed on the basis of data gathered in operations. And in the early days, trying to use them, of course, was difficult because of the primitive computers. And I remember a famous paper by Bill telling you how to simulate a grinding circuit on a pocket calculator, which was quite an achievement. But really, it didn't mature until the invention of the IBM PC, which was in early to mid 1980s. And that made it possible to write a bit of software that carried all the models, allowed you to do model fitting and mass balancing and run simulations. So anybody could do it. You didn't have to go to some expert at the JK to do it. It could be done by anybody. That was the big advance. And in fact, Don McKee, former director of the center, established JK Tech as a startup company whose job was, in fact, to carry this development and market JK SIM. And 30 years later, they're still doing it. JK SIM Float came along later, and of course, there are lots of other simulators in the world today. So lessons, again, academia. I do want to make a point here. I guess the ones I've chosen are ones that either I've been peripherally involved with or I've spoken to those who've been involved. So it's a very idiosyncratic choice. I don't want to make the argument that all good innovation comes from academia. It sure doesn't. But the ones that I'm familiar with tend to. Close collaboration from the beginning because the models were being developed in operation, so they were fit for purpose. Oh yeah, there's that number again. Without the Amira P9 project over decades, this stuff would not have matured to the point where it has today, and that was industry support. Commercialization route, very important, JK Tech. Further experience developed through ongoing use in consulting. So those are half a dozen quick case studies to get a feel for what drives this process. So some lessons from those and other innovations that you could name as well. Innovation is really hard and it takes a long time. And of course, I've just talked about the successes. The field is strewn with failures that you never hear about anymore. They're just buried and we move on to something else. It's increasingly multidisciplinary. So you really need lots of people who are good at different things. And this sounds like a statement of the obvious, doesn't it? You need smart people. But as we'll see in a moment, they aren't always available. Commercialization path is important because innovation does mean making money out of something. And strong links right along the value chain, right along the innovation pipeline are really important. You could say it's between innovators and the users, but the users are sometimes the innovators and vice versa, but you need strong links. Where does innovation come from in our business? Well, we've seen universities, public research, vendors, and engineering companies, manufacturers. The lone inventor, Byron Nelson Concentrator, Barry Lumsden, ProFloat, Dave Wiseman, the LIMM simulator, Chris Kelsey, the Kelsey Jig. These are people who had a passion, a vision, mortgaged their house, made it work and gave their invention to the world. And the other 99% crashed and burned and we never heard about it. So it's a tough gig, but we mustn't forget the lone inventor. And people, of course, in operations, they're smart like everyone else. They're dealing with the problems, so they often have the solutions and the sources of innovation. And we often get ideas from other industries. HPGR from cement is a good example. I'm conscious the air conditioning's gone off. Is this a good idea? Do you want to switch it on at the back? There's a lot of hot air in this room, so. Okay, what are the drivers for innovation? I call them the 7 C's. It's a way to sort of remember what drives things. And here they are, I think. Cash is king, revenue. Costs, of course, we're obsessed by getting costs down quite properly. Competition, not really between mining companies. I don't think, contrary to rumour, mining companies compete with each other, but manufacturers sure do. Compliance, regulatory compliance, community expectations, the culture of the organisations, and of course, as I pointed out, crisis is the biggest and best driver. And they're all present in different proportions for each of the examples that I've looked at. So now, I want to now come to the last part of this talk, which is, I suppose, the most serious point I want to make. I hope I've made the case that as metallurgists, we've been pretty good in the past. We've got a good track record, and we've seen the kinds of conditions that are conducive to effective innovation. You know, what drives it, what nurtures it. I want to now talk about some things I'm worried about. Barriers to innovation. If you buy a book on innovation, there's about 10 chapters on barriers to innovation. But I want to pick half a dozen that I think are peculiar to this industry and that we need to concern ourselves with. The loss of skills and experience in the business. And by the way, this might be controversial, but that's fine. FIFO, fly in, fly out. The decline in these links I've talked about between industry and those who can contribute to innovation. Short-term attitudes to the business, which lead to inconsistent strategies for technology, an unhealthy obsession with IP, and the silo mentality. So I'm going to deal with each of these very briefly, and then we'll draw some conclusions at the end. Loss of skills and experience. Well, I don't think this is going to be a surprise to anybody, but it just seems to me there's a tendency in our industry to cut staff costs indiscriminately when commodity prices are low. Hard-won experience, the corporate memory are lost. They're not replaced. Technical experts who are the conduits for innovation are seen as liabilities rather than assets. Innovation teams get disbanded, technology teams, and people become fearful of change. This is anathema to innovation. You want a really good way to shut off innovation? That's the way to do it. And of course, it happens in cycles. They're linked to the commodity cycles we all understand, and the need to cut costs, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do for a company. But in each cycle, the pools of skills and experience available to innovate and to run the business efficiently is diminished. Look, don't get me wrong. I understand perfectly well the need to match the workforce to the business cycle. I've made people redundant in the organizations that I've worked with. I understand that process, and I understand the need for it, however unhappy it is. But I don't think I've ever fired the corporate memory. I don't think I've ever fired the people who actually understand how the business works. And I find that the problem today is that when we have to cut costs, it's indiscriminate. And I think we need to do better. There's another problem building up. At least the HR companies will tell you this, because of course it's in their interest to tell you this. What they call the retirement tsunami. This is some data from, not from Australia, unfortunately. I couldn't get decent data for Australia, but this is from North America last year. A lot of mining executives are on the point of retirement. There are a lot of people unemployed. I think the figure, the AusIMM figure, is about 17% at the moment. 17. This is the same level as youth unemployment, which we constantly worry about, quite rightly. A lot of people feel they're underemployed, and a lot of other people say they're about to leave the industry. Probably got them on a bad day, so that might not be a particularly reliable figure. But there's a feeling amongst those who know about these things that not only are we getting rid of people ourselves as organizations, but we're also about to face the problems of voluntary departure. And by the way, this creates a feedback loop, which is very undesirable. It negatively impacts future recruitment. So this is data that Peter Hayes, who's here tonight, gave me very kindly, and it should frighten you. This is the graduations from the metallurgical engineering option within chemical engineering here at UQ up to 2018, because of course Peter knows who's in the system now. Back in 2004, I remember it well, there was another crisis. Some good things were done, led largely by Peter. which built up the numbers, and by 2014, 10 years later, it was 29, and then it fell off a cliff, and he expects to graduate 4 people in 2018. Well, why? I'll tell you why, because students aren't stupid. They see what's going on in the industry. They see that, or they take the view, right or wrong, that the industry does not value its graduates, and so they decide not to sign up. Now, this has happened before. Back in 1998, the MCA, Minerals Council of Australia, was concerned about a similar problem, set up a task force which wrote a very famous report called Back from the Brink, which led immediately to money, real green stuff, being put by the industry into some universities to try and help support some of these courses in mining and metallurgy. And it was pretty successful. The numbers built up again. And then we got to 2004, as I say, and all the wheels fell off again because we went through another one of these bloodletting cycles. And what happens is this: we end up with this sort of general pattern of recruitment. Well, as metallurgists, we know systems and processes don't like variability. They really don't. There's a much better way to do business. We've got to find a way of smoothing these things out. We build up to a peak, and then all the wheels fall off, and all the students go away, and then we build up to another peak. And so it goes on. I don't know how many I've seen of these sorts of cycles, but in my lifetime as a professional, but it's at least 4, possibly 5. And I asked myself, would this brilliant piece of work be possible today? I'd like to think so. And I have absolutely no doubt, because I know where they are, there are some little islands of excellence and pockets where this sort of thing would happen today. But the sea level's rising. It's going to cover these islands eventually if we keep on going on like this. And I really worry about this. 20 years ago, we had some great things going on. I think the chance of that happening today, sadly, is somewhat reduced. Well, let me talk about FIFO quickly, fly in, fly out. Now, don't get me wrong, FIFO is here to stay. Lots of good things about FIFO, but if you want a system for reducing the amount of time to think about how you're going to drive the capital in the concentrator, if you want a system that prevents continuity, which innovation requires, FIFO is a great system. And I've talked to a lot of people about this in FIFO sites and elsewhere. And I say to these youngsters, how do you like FIFO? Oh, fantastic. I can go to work and then go off around the world and have a wonderful time. What's it like for actually, being a metallurgist? Oh, hopeless, of course. I mean, we all know that. Oh, okay, fair enough. Now, people have written lots of reports about FIFO. Here's one from the Queensland government last year. It looked at the impact of fly in, fly out on regional economies. And of course, it's a big issue for governments. Lots of other reports have been written on social impact on families and other things. Nobody's ever written a report on the impact of FIFO on tons, concentrate, recovery, and grade, on productivity. I actually asked a company a few years ago, I said, I've got a great deal for you. I went to WA, a very large company, well known to all of you, and said, I think we should do this. And I talked to an HR guy, that was the first mistake, talked to an HR guy. And I said, I think we should study this problem. And he said, yeah, fantastic idea. Well, I never thought of that. I'll go and talk to my colleagues. Well, of course, that was the last I heard of it. I rang him up and said, what happened? He said, oh, yeah, I talked to the technical guys. The bottom line was, it's a can of worms. We don't want to go near it. Well, I'm here to talk about innovation. I think FIFO is bad for innovation. And I don't think it's a lost cause. I think there are different ways to do fly in, fly out that would help rather than hinder innovation. And I think it's something that should be on our list. Industry innovation links, really important. You've seen that in all of the case studies. Interestingly, Australia as a whole, never mind the mining industry, I'll come to the mining industry, is really bad at this. OECD report close to last. A bit like the Olympics.
Actually, we're not.
Almost. So this is a problem that governments worry about, and there's lots of hand-wringing goes on, and we see these kinds of headlines. But I don't want to get too close to the bone, but CSIRO is not doing as much work as it was in this area. WARP doesn't exist anymore. The JK is smaller than it was, and Alice is doing a brilliant job of building that up. CRC mining is no longer funded by, of course, the government. So it's getting pretty tatty at the edges now, this kind of link. And this is a problem that this institute here has. Alvin Lynch's great discovery, his great invention was putting students into operations. So there are some people sitting here who suffered from that, I can see them. But it's a brilliant, actually, way of doing it. It's the key, really, to successful innovation. Send your innovators, your researchers into the operations. Because it ensures that the innovation is fit for purpose. It's an organic process. It's the researchers and the receivers of the research work together, and that's all good for innovation. But loss of staff on the mine sites, various other things, makes it much harder to do. It's not impossible, and I know this institute is working hard to try and make this happen, but it's a shadow of its former self. And by the way, again, this is a national problem. This is a report put out by the government earlier this year, a review of Australia's research training system. This is PhDs and masters people, right across the board, not just mining. Here's a quote from it. There would be value in building a national industry placement scheme of significant scale and scope. So this is what Alvin Lynch worked out 50 years ago. We've suddenly realized this is a good idea. Let's put students into industry. Interestingly, it was chaired by John McGarr, who at the time was running Rio Tinto's Technology and Innovation Group. All the other people on his committee were senior academics. Can you believe that? Well, yes, we can. And I think a great opportunity was lost. But anyway, I make the point that it's a general problem. And talking about these links, we can't forget the MET sector. So this is mining equipment, technology and services. 500 companies in this country. It's the 6th biggest exporter. Iron ore and coal, usual suspects. Education, MET, 15 billion a year. I think the internal turnover is about 90 billion. So these are the companies that supply all the goods and services to the mining industry. And this is a really important sector. And again, the government, even the government has woken up and worried about this. And it's put some money into what it's called one of its growth centres. And here it's called METS Ignited. It's based in Brisbane. And its job is to try and facilitate this link, the industry innovation link, to try and improve the rate of innovation in the MET sector and the way it's capitalized on financially and the way it delivers services to the industry. So people are aware of this problem, but it is a big problem. Next problem, I'm coming to the end. Short-termism. This is, I think, if I was asked to pick the biggest problem, it's this one. Average innovation time constant, 15 years. In fact, all the ones I've showed you are longer than that, but let's give it 15 years. Average tenure of the world's top 40 mining company CEOs, 5 years. In Australia, less than 5 years. Now, I may be stupid, but the tier 1 deposits are multi-decade. So the business is guaranteed, other things being equal, to run for decades. I understand why a CEO might leave after 5 years. Renewal, new ideas. CEO might want to go on and take on other challenges. There may be a poor fit with the company. I mean, all the sorts of reasons for which CEOs come and go. But it's not good for continuity, and it's really bad for the technology policy of the company. So if you have a technologically intense business, which mining is, surely the board needs to have an approach to technology, and many of them do. The problem is CEOs come and go, and CEOs decide what they're going to do. So you get a CEO who's really good on technology, and he builds centres, and he employs people. Next guy comes along and says, what's all this? It's costing us $100 million a year. I'd rather give that to the shareholders. Speaking as a shareholder, I might sympathise with that. And it's all gone. And it goes, and of course, it's also driven by the well-known commodity cycle. So when there's a boom, we must invest, and when there's a bust, no, we mustn't. And this is extraordinarily damaging for innovation. If Apple or Microsoft or Amazon or the pharmaceutical companies or the big car manufacturers ran their technology like this, they'd be out of business. Now, it's not a fair comparison because it's a different business, but it's very unhealthy in my book. And in case you just think it's me rabbiting on, I just want to read some quotes from some other people that come from a report called the VCI report, Innovation State of Play. It's about the mining industry, and it's run every year or a couple of years. Paul Muller is a CEO of a mining company. Short-termism is the biggest problem, and is more so in difficult times. How do you encourage the ability to think medium to long term? It comes down to quality of leadership. Andrew Harding, of course, former boss of Rio Tinto's very successful iron ore business. It becomes harder to find support to do something big in innovation when the sector is at the bottom of the investment cycle. So it varies. The report itself, which brought together the views of a large number of mining CEOs, this is an interesting one. Investor perspectives of mining need to shift from innovation being associated with risk to a lack of innovation being associated with risk to sustainable returns. CEOs acknowledge that miners need to better educate investors. So investors are the worst people. They want their dividends now and next month and the month after, and that's short-termism. So the investor community drives the CEOs, and the CEOs are driven by their salary package, and everything is very short-term. And we're trying to innovate on a 20-year timeline. So what we end up with is confused company strategies. Technology's got to get into the DNA of the business. And every time there's a change of CEO or a change of, we don't change everything. Technology's still there. We still need technology. We still need flotation plants and mills and mines and things. So let's, for goodness sake, settle on some consistent strategies. Right, next one, unnecessary protection of IP. One of the conclusions you got from, I hope, from those case studies was that if you've got a widget, if you invent something like an HPGR or a Jameson cell, you really need protection. You must patent, you must defend it, and all the rest of it. But there's a whole raft of sort of marginal IP, which the lawyers battle to the death on. And I know, because I've got the scars of, I actually wrote the first Amira research contract. Well, I didn't write it. I rewrote it because it was sent us to Amira by Amira. And the universities get involved. They think they're going to make squillions out of this, and Amira represents its people, and the companies think they're going to make squillions. Nobody makes a jot out of this stuff. It's complete waste of time. And I found out over the years, I'm sure you would agree, that anything that enriches lawyers is almost certainly not good for the rest of us. So we had a workshop a few years ago of very senior technical people from around the world, and this is what they said about this problem. The way industry deals with IP is seen as a key barrier, as IP hoarding directly impedes the advance of innovative practice. The point is, the prize goes to those who use it the best, not to those who own it. So if we can just sweep this rubbish away, there's a clearer path to a good solution. Last one, the silo mentality. You're all familiar with this. Universities are complicit in this problem. We train people in silos, so we shouldn't be surprised if they stay in them when they go to a mine site. Look, everyone's conscious of this problem. It is being broken down. I think the relatively new discipline of geometallurgy has played a great role in doing this. But the point is, as I mentioned before, most innovations now, serious ones, are multidisciplinary. We have to have all these people talking to each other in the value chain. So I won't say any more than that, and the solution is really to knock over these sites. I just want to mention this organisation, give it a little wrap. And the reason is some of you know about SEEK, some of you don't, Coalition for Energy Efficient Comminution. It's a completely bizarre organisation, I have to say, and I declare an interest. I'm on the board of this organisation. Joe Pease is our chairman. And it's a very interesting model for the promotion of innovation. So SEEK is there, its sole job, it has one paid employee and an unpaid board of technical people across the world with an interest in this problem. And our job is to promote or catalyze an informed discussion on the problem of energy efficient comminution. That's it. We don't take a position, we don't have labs, we don't do research. We simply promote a discussion. And there are various ways to do that. We have workshops, conference presentations, we've developed a roadmap, we have a website with stuff. We give a medal, in fact 2 medals this year. We have contributed some funding to the development of the energy curve developed by Grant Valentine and Malcolm Powell. And they're all on our website for free use by anybody. We have LinkedIn technical discussions, media activities, newsletters, blah, blah, blah. Not for profit, supported by donations. We have over 20 companies who give modest support for the public good element of what we do. Owen Hegarty and Elizabeth Lewis-Gray are two of our patrons. And it's just an interesting model. Its sole job is actually to, because we think it's a good thing, is to promote innovation without taking a position. So I just leave you with that thought. Okay, summary. We need to and we can innovate better. Let's preserve the corporate memory. Stop firing it. FIFO, I think, needs to look at. Strengthen the innovation links. These are all things that are wonderfully easy to say and much harder to do, of course. Take a longer view, less short-termism. Can we get technology into the DNA of the company? That hopefully would lead to rational long-term management strategies for dealing with technology that doesn't go up and down. Be more relaxed about some IP and tear down the silos. Now, the interesting thing about this list of problems, they're all self-inflicted. They're all self-inflicted. They don't come from outside. We've done it. So the good news is we have the capacity to fix it. If the industry at the highest level, board CEOs, senior managers, have the will to do it. And I would like to ask, as part of this exercise, that we take a new view. Unfortunately, I suspect there aren't any large company CEOs in the audience tonight, so I may be preaching to the converted. But let me finish with a glorious failure of innovation. So I support the England cricket team, so I'm very used to glorious failures. And this is one that we were promised when I went to university, which could help, it's nearly 50 years ago now. We were promised this was the way mining was going to be done in the future. Really simple. The mining step, the fragmentation step, the first part of comminution would be done very simply this way. And I've actually got a video of it, so let me show it to you. Some of you have seen this before, but for those of you who haven't, have a think about what you think this is. It's fantastic. I could see this 1,000 times. Can I show it again? Anybody know what we're looking at? Those who've seen it aren't allowed to answer. Sorry? Yep, that's the one. That's the one. It's an underground nuclear test by the Americans in the late 1960s or early 1970s in their test grounds, which now look like this. So think of each of those holes as an ore body. And what we were told when I went to university in 19... that, you know, forget all the usual stuff, this is how it's going to be. Just blow it up and then we're going to dig it up for the next 20 years and stick it in a modest sized concentrator. There were some things I hadn't thought fully about, which is, I think, a number of quite nasty, long-lived radionuclides, but I'm told that if you get the bomb right, you can actually limit that number. And as Craig mentioned, both the Russians and the Americans worked on the peaceful uses of nuclear bombs. It seems a contradiction in terms, and one of them was to make very large holes in the ground. Well, this is one innovation that hasn't happened yet, but I saw an article, can you believe this, last year in a technical journal somewhere, again suggesting, so what goes around comes around. I want to leave you with a quotation which I think bears your close attention. He that will not apply new remedies must expect new evils, for time is the greatest innovator. In other words, if we don't get off our bottom and do it ourselves, somebody's going to do it for us and we're not going to like it. It was said 400 years ago by Sir Francis Bacon, the first empiricist and the man generally credited with being the first person to understand the scientific method. And I think it bears some thought. So thank you so much for listening.